It was a cold December night, the kind where the frost clings to the windows, and the wind howls through the streets of the small village of Oakwood. The residents were snug in their homes, but for Lisa, it was going to be a long night at the hospital where she worked the night shift as a nurse. Her shift had been quiet, with only a few patients to attend to. Around 2 a.m., Lisa decided to take a quick break and stepped outside to get some fresh air. The hospital parking lot was empty, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows. As she leaned against the wall, she noticed a figure standing at the far end of the lot, near the old oak tree. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He stood perfectly still, almost as if he were a statue. A shiver ran down Lisa's spine, but she tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just someone passing through. But as she turned to go back inside, she heard a soft, chilling whisper carried by the wind. Lisa? Her heart skipped a beat. How did he know her name? She turned around, but the figure hadn't moved. He stood there, motionless, his face still hidden in shadow. Lisa hurried back inside, her pulse racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The rest of her shift passed uneventfully, but when it was time to go home, she felt a growing sense of dread. As she walked to her car, she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the stranger to appear again. But the parking lot was empty. Lisa drove home, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. When she finally arrived at her apartment, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She locked the door behind her and checked all the windows, making sure everything was secure. That night, sleep eluded her. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the image of the stranger from her mind. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard a soft tapping on her bedroom window. Her blood ran cold. She lived on the second floor. No one could reach her window without a ladder. Gathering her courage, Lisa slowly approached the window. There, standing outside, was the stranger, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were hollow and his mouth twisted into a sinister grin. He raised a gloved hand and tapped on the window again, the sound echoing through the silent room. Lisa, let me in. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but the signal was gone. Panic set in as she realized she was completely alone. The stranger continued to tap on the window, his voice growing more insistent. Lisa, let me in. Desperate, she ran to her front door, ready to flee. But as she reached for the handle, she felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She screamed and turned around, but there was no one there. The tapping stopped and the room fell eerily silent. For days, Lisa was haunted by the stranger. She saw him everywhere, in the shadows, in her dreams, always watching, always waiting. She became a recluse, afraid to leave her apartment, terrified that he would find her again. Eventually, the sightings stopped, but the fear never left her. Lisa moved to a different town, hoping to escape the nightmare. But every night as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the night stranger was still out there, searching for her. And sometimes in the dead of night, she would hear the faintest whisper on the wind. Lisa, let me in. "15-year-old Sam was excited to start his first year at boarding school. It wasn't just the promise of new friends and independence, it was also the stories he had heard about the place. The campus was old, with sprawling brick buildings and tall trees that whispered in the wind. But the dorms, especially room 214 in the north wing, were infamous for something else entirely. The upperclassmen loved to scare new students with tales of room 214. They said it was cursed. The last boy who stayed there disappeared without a trace, and no one ever found out what happened to him. But Sam didn't believe in ghosts or curses. When he was assigned to room 214, he laughed it off as coincidence. His roommate Ethan arrived later that evening. Ethan was quiet, almost too quiet. He barely spoke as they unpacked, and when Sam tried to start a conversation, Ethan only offered short, one-word answers. Something about him felt off. That night, as Sam lay in bed, he heard whispering. It was faint, almost like the wind, but the words were unmistakable. "Sam, don't trust him." Sam sat up, his heart racing. He glanced at Ethan's bed, but Ethan was lying still, his back turned. Maybe he was imagining things. Shaking his head, Sam lay back down and forced himself to sleep. The next day, Sam noticed strange things about Ethan. He never seemed to eat in the cafeteria, disappearing during mealtimes and reappearing later without explanation. His eyes were always bloodshot and he never seemed to blink. That night, Sam woke again to the sound of whispering. But this time it was louder. "Sam, he's not real." Sam turned on his bedside lamp and looked over at Ethan's bed. It was empty. The blankets were perfectly smooth, as if no one had been lying there at all. A chill ran down Sam's spine. He checked the door, but it was locked from the inside. Ethan couldn't have left without unlocking it. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The room fell deathly silent. Then the closet door creaked open. Sam froze, his eyes locked on the dark gap in the closet. A figure stepped out, Ethan. But his face wasn't right. His eyes were completely black, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Sam," Ethan said, his voice distorted and echoing. "You shouldn't have stayed here." Sam bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. Ethan, or whatever he was suddenly right behind him, his cold breath on Sam's neck. "Why do they always run?" Ethan whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Desperate, Sam grabbed his desk chair and swung it, shattering the window. Ignoring the shards of glass cutting into his skin, he climbed out and ran into the night. The next morning, the school staff found Sam wandering the campus, pale and shaking. He refused to return to room 214, and after hearing his story, the administration moved him to a different dorm. But the strangest part? When they went to clear out his belongings, there was no record of anyone named Ethan ever being assigned to that room.